Question: should a public school teacher be allowed to force students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance? And if they don't, the student will be punished by the school. Let's check out this story. My name is Nathan Laurie. If you are new here, we talk about the law and the facts. If you're about that life, don't forget to like this video, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. This is a story from the great state of Texas where school officials pressured a young woman to write the Pledge of Allegiance and have to pay $90,000 to the family. So we've taken a couple of First Amendment cases before and looked at them. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to look at the facts, we're going to look at the law, and then I'm going to let you decide whether you agree with the school for settling or if you think that this wasn't a violation of the First Amendment or this young lady's First Amendment rights. So let's get a little background. So here is the plaintiff, Miss Oliver. Let's listen to what she has to say.
She spoke back in 2017.
I also believe that we live in a country where there isn't justice and freedom for all, and so I'm not going to stand for a pledge that says there is when there really isn't.
The student's mother filed a lawsuit against the school district and several staffers, accusing several of them of retaliation and discrimination as a result of the student's stance.
If a person wants to speak or express themselves or decide not to speak or not to express themselves, that is protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution.
So now you see what the student is alleging. So let's look at some of the facts of the case to see what exactly happened. So this is the Washington Post, and here is the story. Marie Oliver had for 4 years refused to recite the Pledge of Allegiance at her Texas high school. Then in her senior year, her teacher gave the class an assignment. She and other students would have to write the pledge. So she's not saying it. So the student says, here is an assignment, you're going to have to write it. Now, those who did not would get a 0, sociology professor Ben J. Arnold told his class. According to the federal lawsuit Oliver filed against him. Then he compared people who refused to recite the pledge to Soviet communists, members of the Islamic faith seeking to impose Sharia law, and those who condone pedos, the lawsuit says. In Texas, they got to have a better standard for hiring teachers because I don't think that's right in any school district. You say, like, this guy should be fired if he said these things. Oliver did not recite or write the pledge. Instead, the 12th grader drew a squiggly line, turned it in. She claims that, as promised, Arnold gave her a 0, something he has since disputed. So now the rest of the article goes into some more context, but essentially that is the claim that she's making. She's saying that this government employee or this government official, the teacher, forced her to write the Pledge of Allegiance, and if she didn't do so, she would be given a 0. She would be harmed, right? there would be a negative mark given to her. And also the harassment, calling her supporting pedos, saying that she was a communist or she wanted Sharia law, like all these negative things. That's the harassment piece. And then you have the retaliation piece of actually giving her a 0. Even though he claims that he didn't, that's the lawsuit in a nutshell. So now let's listen to the lawyers for the case explain their reasoning on why they believe that this is a violation of her rights.
Attorneys say a years-long legal case tied to the Pledge of Allegiance at Klein Oak High School has come to an end.
I'm glad that the defendant finally made the smart decision and settled the case before we went to trial.
Jeffrey Blackwell is litigation counsel for the civil rights group American Atheists and an attorney for the plaintiff.
The rights of students to refrain from ideological or religious statements has been well settled since West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett.
He says the Klein Oak case was about a student identified in court records as MO sitting out or declining to participate in the Pledge of Allegiance at school. She spoke back in 2017.
So the lawyer in this case cited another case that was back in the 40s. I'll pull it up. So this is the case he cited, West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. Now, in this case, so people understand the relevance of this case, this is a First Amendment case in which the West Virginia School Board had a mandatory law that forced all students and staff to not only say and recite the pledge, but also salute the flag. And it went up to the Supreme Court as compelled speech, right? And in this case, the Supreme Court said forcing a student to say something is a violation of the First Amendment. And that's because it's what's known as compelled speech. You can't force me to say the Pledge of Allegiance. You can't force me not to say the Pledge of Allegiance, right? That's the freedom of speech. You have the freedom to both speak and not to speak. And compelling someone to say something is a violation of that freedom. So it's interesting because in this case, this is the salute that these Jehovah's Witnesses families were trying to fight against. So again, this is, remember, 1943. This is during World War II. So this is the salute that the parents were fighting that they didn't want their kids to do. So this is the salute. It looks very close to, I usually call it the Nazi salute case because that's what this looks like. This looks like they're performing Nazi salutes. So this was mandatory under state law that they had to do every morning. And parents were like, this is crazy. We're not going to do this. And when the Supreme Court said, you cannot force students to do things like this. You can't force them to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So that's the history. So now, I know there's going to be a lot of questions. Well, what about Colin Kaepernick, right? People are going to say, well, Colin Kaepernick did the same thing. He kneeled, and, why wasn't this protected, or was this protected? The difference between Colin Kaepernick's case and this case, either the Texas case or the West Virginia case, is that Colin Kaepernick is working for a private company. So the First Amendment protections, he has no First Amendment protection to do this, right? There's no First Amendment right for him to kneel as an employee of the NFL. Now, the NFL has its own rules and stuff, but the NFL doesn't have to extend that freedom of speech to Colin Kaepernick. So if they can make a rule saying everybody has to stand, and he would have to stand, and it wouldn't be a violation of his rights because the NFL's a private company. Now, if he was working for the government, and the government said you can't kneel or you can't do this, now we have something issue. So the government isn't the one infringing on Colin Kaepernick's rights. It would be the NFL, and the NFL as a private company can have those restrictions. So, no matter how you feel about Colin Kaepernick, legally, the NFL allowed him to do it, and the government couldn't come forward and say, you can't kneel for the Pledge of Allegiance. But if Colin Kaepernick was to sue, his lawsuit would probably be dismissed because the NFL is not a government agency. So he wouldn't be able to sue under this same theory. So these are really totally different cases. In one case, we're talking about a school, a public school, these are government employees telling people what they have to say. First Amendment violation. Colin Kaepernick, private company telling its private employees what they can and cannot do during the work hour, not a violation of the Constitution. That's the difference here. So now what happened at the end of our case? Well, obviously, the school district settled because there's extremely strong precedent that they were going to lose, right? You can't force students to do this. You have so many cases where this has happened before. So they paid $90,000 to the student and her family for their violations of their constitutional rights. And here the article writes, administrators later reprimanded Arnold for his pledge writing assignment, telling him to be neutral in class discussions and sensitive to students' rights, according to court documents. Arnold is still working at Klein High School as a social studies teacher, according to staff directory. In 2020, the district honored him with an article about his starting a 50-year at the school. About his starting a 50-year. Maybe he's been at the school for 50 years. So this is somebody who's been there for a long time. Mr. Arnold is a huge supporter of all things Klein Oak. Principal Thomas Henley said in the article, he's at all sporting events and fine arts events at Klein Oak, and we are so thankful for him. Let's look at the staff directory, see what this guy looks like. So this is the teacher that calls the students communist sympathizers and pedo sympathizers if they don't say the pledge. This guy is old school. I think he needs to retire. So he's just cost the school district $90,000 to settle. So my question for you, do you think the school district should have settled? Do you think they should have fought? Do you think that they were in the right? Now, I think it's clear that the First Amendment doesn't allow compelled government speech, and that's essentially what this teacher was doing. He was compelling students in this form of government speech. And the Supreme Court has said time since, the 40s, right? There's almost 100 years of case law saying you can't do such a thing. So I think the school was right to settle. It makes sense because I think you could have lost a lot more if you didn't settle. And, they've cost their school district some serious cash. But let me know what you think in the comment section. Do you think, if you were the school district, would you have fought? Do you think they should have settled? Do you think this girl's rights were violated? That's really the question. Do you think her rights were violated? Should students, because there are some of you out there who think students should be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance, forced to be thankful to be in this country. If you feel that way, let me know in the comment section. Others would say that, the government shouldn't be able to compel anybody to say anything. And that's why we have a First Amendment. I'll see you next time. Peace.